Hello and welcome, everyone. So glad you made it here to join us today. I am Pamela Lavitt, the Director of Arts and Ideas and Festivals at the Strom Jewish Community Center. This is actually our last Arts and Ideas author conversation of our Chew on This speaker series, where we present authors, thought leaders, and chefs to feed the mind, body, and spirit. This 2025-2026 series theme was Roots and Resilience. It explored how rootedness in family, cultural, and spiritual traditions can sustain us, fill our cups in trying and polarizing, fraught times. The series highlights this year included former Michelle Obama's chief speechwriter, Sarah Hurwitz, keynote speaker, Rabbi Angela Bookdahl, who you can see we're also doing a book club with in a few weeks. And last week, we had the privilege of hearing from Israeli Haaretz journalist Lee Yaron on her book 10-7 on the topic of the future of Israel, hope and resilience. Today is the anniversary of Israel's Declaration of Independence, promising equality, social justice, and democratic values, including advocating for rights of all citizens. In line with that promise and the need for our work to continue building a just future of solidarity here and in Israel, I'm thrilled to introduce today's conversation with progressive journalist Ben Lorber, who addresses head-on historic currents of polarization, these weaponizing debates over what is and what is not anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, with apologies, Shane Burley is unable to join us today, so Ben will have to carry the load for the both of them, but I'm also thrilled that we'll be welcoming Diane Dvora-Falchuk as joining as moderator, and I will introduce the both of them in just a moment. The book consolidates its guiding principle as follows. In spite of a political culture that tries to divide us, Jews and other marginalized groups are realizing that when we rely on each other, we become stronger than the voices arrayed against us. While there has been well-documented increases in anti-Semitism attacks since the Hamas attacks of October 7th, Burley and Lorber argue that widespread allegations of anti-Semitism can also divert attention away from rootedness in right-wing conspiracies, and ultimately this work that they do can bring a more resilient, just, and connected world if we work together. Together as well today, I hope that we can learn how to build safety through solidarity. And with that in mind, let's begin. I'd like to introduce first the moderator. Diana Dvora-Falchuk, MSW, is a mother, artist, facilitator, activist, strategist, host, and policymaker dedicated to growing the capacity of Jews and non-Jews to dismantle racism and anti-Semitism, repair related ruptures, and build together towards collective justice, healing, and thriving. She works through her own consultancy and is a part-time senior advisor with Diaspora Alliance, and she's from Seattle, so we're so happy to have her join us. Ben Lorber is a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates, a social movement think tank, where he studies and publishes on anti-Semitism and white Christian nationalism. Prior, he worked supporting justice-driven youth Jewish communities across the country and writes extensively on anti-Semitism, Israel-Palestine, and Jewish identity. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us. Maybe unmute yourselves, and welcome, Diana. I'll see you both at the end, and enjoy your conversation. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Pamela. It's
Thanks,
great to be
Pamela.
here in this conversation with you, Ben.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Diane, and thanks to Pamela and everyone at the SJCC for having me.
Yeah, ditto. I want to just say thanks again to Pamela and to everybody at the Strom JCC for inviting us to have this conversation with you all, with each other, and with you all today. I just want to start by saying to you, Ben, before we get into the juicy questions, how useful this book has been for me personally and for so many people I know, and helping us to really articulate what solidarity looks like what that even is tangibly, and why we need this approach to understand and actually fight anti-Semitism effectively. And the way in the book that you and Shane hold everyone's humanity and share insights into how we can stay in relationship and move the needle toward a world without anti-Semitism, including and especially amidst violence, fear, anger, heartbreak, and what can feel like irreparable fractures. feels so fitting for the theme of this series, Roots and Resilience. And I'm excited that it's the final talk of the series. Hope that feels grounding for everybody. And when I first read the book almost 2 years ago, I really sped through it. I think I told you that. I was like reading quickly, marking it up, and turning down the corners and coming back to things. And I've since incorporated many of the quotes from the book into trainings and other resources that I've developed to support people in their efforts to understand and fight anti-Semitism. So I just want to thank you for that really important contribution. I know there are many others who have been using it in that same way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's so much for us to talk about. So I think we should just dive in. Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay, great. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about like the sort of understanding of anti-Semitism in the book. You talk about what anti-Semitism scholars Ben Gidley, Brandon McGeever, and David Feldman from the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism in the UK call the reservoir of anti-Semitism that was created in Christian European society and, spread everywhere from there, and how this reservoir holds conspiracy theories and related stereotypes about the Jewish threat to Western civilization via, this idea of the sneaky, greedy, power and control hungry Jew who is, behind the scenes orchestrating what's happening in governments, the banks, the media, etc. And also how this same character of the Jew harms Christian children. And you write about how this is what it means for a story to, a story about a group or people to become structural. In other words, it's woven into the ideological fabric of our Western civilization and really utilized by generations of reactionary movements to fortify existing social hierarchies and manage the tensions of global capitalism. And that is a lot. And I wondered if you could like break that down a little bit and talk about why you and Shane want your readers to understand anti-Semitism in this structural way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, Shane and I come, at this from many years and progressive and left-wing movements where, often, people have a lot easier time maybe wrapping their heads around something like anti-Black racism. They don't, it's plain to see if you look at the world around us how how centuries of chattel slavery and Jim Crow have led to so many of the racialized inequalities that Black folks in America face today. But often people on the left have a hard time sort of wrapping their heads around anti-Semitism as structural in the same way. They might think, well, Jewish folks, a lot of Jewish folks have white skin privilege. Some are, middle or upper class. What's the problem here? And people might, often don't see it in the world around them as tangibly. And so I think that's why we wanted to highlight this notion of structural anti-Semitism, the idea that anti-Jewish oppression is really baked into the society that we inhabit. And it comes from ideas about Jews, as you said, ideas that are passed down, really that go back to really the first centuries of Christianity, right? When Christianity kind of grew out of Judaism, it had to answer this question of, if Jesus is the Messiah that's prophesied in Jewish scripture, why are there still Jews around who don't who wait for another Messiah, who don't believe in Jesus? And over the centuries, these tropes evolved of demonizing Jews, literally turning Jews into demons, associating Jews with evil as the enemies of Jesus, as the enemies of, especially in Europe, the enemies of Christian civilization. And if you fast forward into, the modern world, the last 200 years or so, these evolved into the conspiracy theory, right? Like you said, the idea that Jews are this controlling kind of secret, hidden force, behind, politics, government, the media, the economy. And it's a story that is very convenient for nationalists, for authoritarians and hate mongers to tell, especially in times of of crisis and discontent. When so many people are fed up at the way the world is going. People look around and they can't make ends meet. They can't put food on the table. They're alienated from their neighbors. They don't see a future. Anti-Semitism has this ability to point a finger at, a group that's scapegoated for really being the root cause of it all. I mean, there's a reason that, Nazi Germany, that fascism rose after the Great Depression. Millions of people were looking for answers. And today, it's the same. It's not the same thing, hopefully, but we face so much inequality in our world, so much unchecked, oligarchy, the really collapse of our democracy. Everyone is alienated and confused in so many ways, and so anti-Semitism is this. It's a meta explanation. It says, don't look at systems like racism. Don't look at your work conditions, your boss. Don't look at how you can make your life better by uniting with your neighbors, your coworkers, and fighting for justice. Instead, just blame this Jewish cabal up at the top of it all. So it's this. That's why we see Trump and Elon Musk and so many others using these tropes right now. So really bringing that in can help people kind of understand how this is connected, to the rise of racism, the rise of white supremacy and white nationalism. It's connected to attacks on trans folks. It's connected, to attacks on democracy. Anti-Semitism is rising right now in our authoritarian, climate, and the way out of it all, or the way, to kind of see a better future. Is to really band together and try to build something different right now in this time.
Thank you, Ben, for really articulating that. And I want to go a little bit more into this piece of like the relationship between sort of buying into, accepting or adopting conspiracy theories as the explanation for, vast inequity and, not being able to pay the rent or put food on the table for your kids. And like what it means to actually build a project that does actually serve everybody, Jews included. And in the book, you talk about how, for example, during COVID in that first year in 2020, there was a study that came out in Britain about, how on social media networks that were like particularly against vaccines, there was also a spike in anti-Semitism, that those two things were correlated. And there were, people talking about and kind of comparing public health measures that were designed to protect everybody to Nazi Germany, to like anti-Semitic, laws in Nazi Germany. And talking about how, this conspiracism kind of kept working people fragmented and unable to actually organize our political leaders to provide families the resources needed to weather the pandemic and actually weather that well and together. And I really felt like this was a great example of how most people who are not in control of politics and the economy have a vested stake in fighting the spread of anti-Semitism, because it really deflects from what's really happening, like you've been saying. And you don't really stop there, though. You go further and you say, this is why what's needed is the left's project of human emancipation, so that people can actually vote for robust social safety nets, well-resourced communities. You talk about, supporting an end to inequality so they're facing less desperate conditions. And so I wanted to just kind of ask you, first of all, can you say more about this material basis for solidarity between Jews and non-Jews? And also, what is support for capitalism? This is like kind of taking it to a bit of a different place, but what does support for capitalism and ethno-nationalism have to do with the attacks on these kinds of shared stakes, proposals, policies, approaches to fighting anti-Semitism, such as the attacks we're seeing on Mamdani, for example, in New York City?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I want to stay in the present, but I have to put on the historian hat for a moment and
Please
take us
do.
to I think a lot about really almost literally 100 years ago. Henry Ford was actually, people don't know this, but Henry Ford was one of the chief spreaders of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 20s and 30s. He took a conspiracy theory text called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That was the turn of the century, the main kind of lie, a forgery that said that that there's this shadowy cabal, the Elders of Zion, who are responsible for everything going wrong in the world. This forgery started in Russia, but around the 20s, Henry Ford started mass printing it in the United States. He founded a paper called the Dearborn Independent.
Mhm.
He started printing, segments of this. He would have his employees hand it out to customers in Ford auto shops around the country. And the reason someone like Henry Ford, wanted to do that, he was afraid of black and white auto workers coming together in his Ford auto shops and joining unions and fighting for an 8-hour workday and fighting for living wages. And he wanted to kind of spread the idea that your real enemy isn't oligarchs like him. Your real enemy is the elders of Zion, right? I think that's a really clear example of how these conspiracy theories, serve the interests of what we might call the 1%, right? Yeah. Today you have someone like Elon Musk who loves to tweet about, how George Soros is the enemy of Western civilization, how George Soros, owns the media and controls the government. Meanwhile, Elon Musk, literally owns our public square in many ways. I mean, he owns Twitter, the kind of premier social media outlet, and with initiatives like Doge, he's playing a huge role in literally controlling the government. So why is it useful for someone like Elon Musk to spread these conspiracy theories to buy an entire social media platform and turn it into a hub for anti-Semitic content? He wants people to believe these conspiracy theories because he doesn't want people to think that, hey, maybe we need a really a root cause change of the way that we live. I think so often we are used to thinking of fighting anti-Semitism as these kind of putting a band-aid on the issue, hiring more police or curbing social media content here and there, or doing more Holocaust education in schools. These all can be important, but I think what we get at in our book is that we want like a root causes approach. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if we don't get at the root causes of inequality, that leaves so many people alienated and frustrated and so fed up at the way things are going, that's the most a surefire way to really take the wind out of the sails of anti-Semitism, to try to remove a lot of people's alienation
Mhm.
and remove the source of their anger by kind of building a better resourced society, by building more healthcare, by building more neighborhood connection, ultimately by I think ending economic exploitation. I think is a way to kind of get at the root of why people feel so afraid and feel like they need to punch up at this cabal. That's a lot of what we try to get at the book, and it might seem kind of pie in the sky, but ultimately, I think people are hungry for more radical solutions now. People are hungry for a real change in the way that our society is set up, and I think we have to kind of look at that more like imaginative horizon as we look for answers in this time.
What you're saying, I really appreciate that. What you're saying makes me think a lot about how, in some of the, analysis of the like very extreme critiques of, for example, the policies of Mayor Mamdani, there is this really attachment to capitalism, attachment to ethno-nationalism that exists within the Jewish community, but also far beyond, of course, the Jewish community. And I'm curious if you have any insights around that, given the history that you just talked about.
Yeah. I mean, when I see, it's really sad. I mean, when I see someone like Mayor Mamdani, I think of other social democratic mayors of New York City, like LaGuardia. And I talked to my grandmother, she's 95 years old. she grew up in the Bronx. She loves LaGuardia, the memory of LaGuardia and all that he did for working people in New York. And she thinks Mamdani is an enemy of the Jewish people. And I think it's this is a person who just a few days ago just devoted a record number, I think $26 million or something like that to try to fund the Office of Hate Crimes in New York. It's an agenda that I think can put Jewish people side by side with others in the fight for a multiracial and just democracy today.
Ben, that I love that vision of like side by side, we're in it with others. And that's kind of where I wanted to go in our conversation. As you were talking, I was thinking about, okay, so the book is called Safety Through Solidarity. Let's talk a little bit more about solidarity. What is this? People use that word all the time. People don't always know what they mean by it. We don't always say what we mean by it. And, I'm thinking about something that our beloved friend and colleague Dove Kent once said that you actually quote in the book, which is solidarity is not easy. And I've heard her also say things like solidarity is messy, right? And I think of like how I've had so many moments, throughout my time working on helping non-Jews understand what anti-Semitism is and why we need to have it part of our, work for equity and justice, et cetera. How hard it can feel sometimes to kind of have to make the case to other people to have the backs of Jews because people don't already understand that. And that can feel really othering to me personally, right? When I'm in that conversation or in those spaces, and how much that's required me to really like slow down, be present with my own feelings before I respond or react, really lean into relationships and really try to see if I can hear and effectively understand other people in order to interrupt some of the thinking that is conspiratorial or is just, totally inaccurate and biased. And really, as part of that, like understanding what these other people actually need from me and from other Jews so that we can be in a reciprocal relationship where we're both, partners are able to say, hey, I got you. Hey, I got you. And that is understood, right? There's trust. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this, like what is solidarity as you talk about it in the book? And, what do you think it will take for more Jews to be able to show up for other groups targeted by different forms of oppression, including Palestinians and others who strongly identify with the experiences of Palestinians? Because I think that's where some of the tension is, or a lot of the tension is right now.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I mean, we talked to a lot of social justice organizers and activists when we wrote the book, and yeah, we heard what Dove said. Solidarity is not easy. It's trying. It's reaching for each other. It's failing, and it's messing up, and it's still showing up. It's still trying. We heard people who talked about the great differences that can arise, not only around Israel-Palestine, but around different experiences with race and class in the U.S. As we talked about, we interviewed organizers in Missouri who were trying to build bonds, between white Jewish and Black non-Jewish communities, and the differences of experience of race and class often were very hard. And we also heard people who said, solidarity is easy. You just show up. And I really liked, that reminder too, because I think what we heard is that these difficulties, these divisions are so much easier. They aren't always easy to manage, but they're not impossible to manage if you already have relationships. I mean, if your synagogue, if your JCC, if your Jewish community has a history of showing up, for immigrant rights, showing up, for work against racism or police brutality, in building relationships with Muslim neighbors and friends and mosques and having those relationships over the long haul, already in place. When these issues come up around something like Israel Palestine, they often aren't as insurmountable, and you're often able to kind of sit with disagreement and sit with discomfort and sit with tension, but not let it kind of corrode the foundation. And we say to people, if the first time you're reaching out to a community partner is during one of these high stakes and very overdetermined and very public, spats about Israel-Palestine, if that's the first time you're building a relationship, then that's, ultimately that's where the problem is, right? And so I do think, yeah, I mean, I think, I also want to say there's a history of these relationships, not going well if there are red lines around issues like Israel-Palestine. And I think we all have to kind of work to build our muscle of, on the one hand, you're granting no quarter to bigotry, to anti-Semitism, or to Islamophobia, and demanding, respect. Yeah, yeah, but also being able to hold radical difference. I mean, as we all know, there is, a radical spectrum of opinion right now, around issues like Israel-Palestine, or Zionism, including within the Jewish community, of course, and in the broader world. And to be able to try to build those relationships, and to hold them across those differences, and to find things that we can agree on. And it goes both ways. I think all partners in that relationship, ideally need to be able to hold a measure of difference and to be able to meet people where they're at, and to build around issues that matter that we can agree on. We interviewed, Hasidic communities, in Williamsburg, New York, who had a lot of differences with their neighbors, but they could agree on local issues of rent control and of prison reform and other things that matter to members of that community. So finding where you can build, and finding a common ground and being able to kind of hold space for that radical disagreement, and still kind of find a horizon of working together. I mean, that's ultimately, what solidarity I think can look like, at its best. Realizing that we all rise and fall together. And like we say, in the book, anti-Semitism is deeply connected to other forms of bigotry, and we can't solve it, on our own. And so I think, is showing up in true concern for other communities. And also expecting them to have our back as well, I think is how we can start to build those relationships that are being tested right now, in a lot of ways.
And what you're saying, Ben, I'm hearing like with that structural understanding of how at a root level there is this interconnection between all groups that are targeted by hate and discrimination and oppression. That's very different from some of the approaches that, are advocated by many Jewish institutions, for example, in terms of, for how we fight anti-Semitism, that there is kind of more of that interpersonal level emphasis and kind of how we treat people. And we're not necessarily able to find those, connections at that root cause level. And I just want to appreciate that because I am finding, I know in the work that I'm doing that moving people is really very helpful when I both understand how like my safety, belonging, justice for me and other Jews is actually very much intertwined with that of these, many other groups, and I can come with that openness to supporting them. And that's what I'm hearing you saying.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think back, unfortunately, I mean, to the worst anti-Semitic massacre, in American history was, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. And the mass shooter was a white nationalist who targeted that synagogue, because he thought that, that the Jews at that, synagogue were behind, mass immigration. He was angry that the synagogue had done, fundraisers for Hayas, and he thought that, there's a Jewish conspiracy behind immigration. And what that tells you is that, that was an anti-Semitic attack, and it was also deeply motivated, by the broader climate of anti-immigrant bigotry. This person was doing an anti-immigrant, propaganda, on social media, on Fox News. Yeah, there have been, other attacks. Yeah, there was an attack on a supermarket, in a majority black neighborhood, in Albany, New York in 2022. the person murdered 10 Black non-Jewish Americans. His manifesto was also full of anti-Semitism. So we see that we literally can't fight anti-Semitism and can't hope to end it unless we're also, taking on the fight against anti-immigrant xenophobia, anti-Blackness. In our moment and in the past, they really are all connected. They all come from the same stew of white supremacy. And so having that perspective, yeah, makes us see that the fighting for immigrant rights, of fighting against the deportation machine, showing up for Black Lives Matter, that very directly is also a part of the fight against anti-Semitism. And being able to keep that in mind is also part of solidarity, as you're saying.
Mm. Thank you for articulating that. And I think I'm not sure, but I think you might have been referring to the Buffalo massacre. Is that
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
totally.
yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify. I'm glad and also not glad. And I remember that moment and like reading that manifesto and feeling like, wow, like if this is not such a powerful example of how this is all connected. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so I want to kind of like not exactly a pivot because it is all connected, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the relationship between the US and Israel and what that has to do with anti-Semitism. Um, in the book, you talk about the kind of special relationship that the US touts with Israel, and how it's not driven by genuine solidarity that the US holds toward Jews, and that rather the US uses Israel to anchor American geopolitical dominance in the Middle East. And you go on to quote Joe Biden telling Congress in 1986, and he's since, said that many times since, were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. And, this, of course, I think probably many folks here may know, and you write about this in the book as well, is part of this trajectory of, European Christian governments' roles in establishing and providing financial and political support for a state for Jews in the land of Israel, Palestine, that, to paraphrase your colleagues Jonathan Brenneman and Aidan Orley from Political Research Associates, would serve kind of this threefold purpose. One being a strategic outpost for Western political and economic interests in the Middle East. The second being to rid Europe of its Jewish problem. And the third being that through that mass migration of European Jews, out of Europe to the land of Israel, Palestine, bring about the second coming of Christ. And I'm curious, what you see as the connection between these Western Christian dominant governments' strategic support for the state of Israel and the ways those same governments have been using anti-Semitism and claims of protecting Jews to attack civil and constitutional rights here in the US. Specifically, of course, this is happening in other Western governments throughout Europe, the UK, Central, South America. Um, how do you see this playing out? When it comes to the war in Iran and Lebanon, specifically, but maybe starting with kind of the impact on, civil and constitutional rights here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot there. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, I think the second Trump administration has made this very clear, I think, to a lot of American Jews. I think there's a feeling in most of our Kishkas, unfortunately not all of us, but I think most American Jews know in our gut that in the MAGA movement, the Trump administration, their love for Jews, their claims to protect Jews are often very instrumental. I mean, this is if we're talking about someone like Trump, this is a person who will, who's been on record saying things like the only people I want to count my money are little guys with yarmulkes, or who demonizes George Soros as the arch enemy of Western civilization. Who, I mean, there's just too many examples to count uh, of the anti-Semitism he is all too happy to foster. This is a person who had dinner with Nick Fuentes, I mean, during his second presidential campaign. So he is happy to court anti-Semites in this coalition and to spread anti-Semitic rhetoric. And he also claims to be the best friend of the Jewish people, but he does that through through using the ICE and the deportation machine to kidnap to kidnap people like Mahmoud Khalil and other students to shred their constitutional rights, to weaponize DHS to screen the social media posts of people who are trying to get visas into the country. I mean, he is through defunding universities and higher education. I mean, he's using the so-called fight against anti-Semitism to suppress critics of Israel, including many Jews and primarily Arab and Muslim and Black folks. And it's a campaign that I think is very self-serving and done to further the authoritarian attacks on education, on higher education in our country, to further efforts at deportation. I mean, this is a it's a campaign that is very much in line with the deeper MAGA agenda of dismantling the last guardrails of our democracy in the name of protecting Jews. And I think most American Jews see right through it because we know that a robust democracy in this country is key to keeping us all safe. And this current war on Iran, I think, is very similar. I mean, certainly the Israeli government has played a significant role, but we also have people like Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a diehard Christian Zionist, who is saying that we have to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age because it's God's will. Or pastors like John Hagee, who heads Christians United for Israel, which has more members in that one Christian Zionist organization than the entire American Jewish population. I think it's over 12 million members at the last count. He supports the war, on Iran because he wants to bring the end times, where the entire Middle East is going to be engulfed an apocalyptic war, and Jesus is going to come back, and Jews in Israel and around the world have to convert or perish. So these people, say they are allies of the Jews, but they are using us for their goals, and I think it's very important for us to all see through it. Those of us who are in the Palestine Solidarity camp, who oppose Zionism, and those of us who might still identify as Zionists, but or might have different views on Israel Palestine, but can clearly see that this issue is being weaponized at the highest levels by Christian nationalists who want to build an America that has no room for Jews or Muslims or other minorities. And so I think we have to kind of reject that pact and look towards solidarity and look to a different model of Jewish, safety beyond nationalism. I think a lot of what the Israeli right and supporters of the Netanyahu government are trying to sell American Jews as a vision of Jewish, safety that's founded upon kind of higher walls and tighter borders and more militarization. And that's not a sustainable path for us to be safe. It's not a path for anyone to be safe on this planet. And I think reaching for a different horizon of solidarity is the best shot we have, I think, at breaking out of this and aiming towards a different future.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ben. And like again, like everything you go through these great examples and get into the specifics. And as you're talking, I'm pulling back and thinking about, right, we don't really within Jewish community have a conversation about Christian supremacy. That hasn't been, socialized or normalized or part of our understanding so much yet. And I'm finding that in a lot of progressive and left spaces where I am, that is also, it is an uncomfortable conversation, but it is a huge aha moment and point of connection for so many groups, including Muslims, who understand, the history of Muslims in Christian Europe and near Christian Europe and under Christian colonial rule. So again, I just appreciate that we're able to talk about that here. And your book does a great job, I think, of describing that history and giving people an opportunity to do their own research into, how it's manifesting currently. Um, I do want to talk about a little bit more, um, just kind of thinking about how, you know, anti-Semitism is showing up in spaces that are, dedicated to, Palestinian liberation, that are, dedicated to fighting other forms of oppression. You tell a really powerful story in the book about being at a Palestine solidarity gathering, an activist gathering years ago. So definitely before October 7th, when the speaker, who was a non-Jew, made a comment that quote unquote Zionist capital is the reason Africa is underdeveloped and that MLK was murdered for criticizing Israel. And you describe this like shrinking feeling that you have in your body, and then like physically actually shrinking in your seat and feeling this tension of, wanting to say something in this busy room full of people, and initiate, like really wanting to initiate a generative conversation about why we all need to understand and fight anti-Semitism, and kind of the fear of being accused of defending Israel's treatment of Palestinians, and having, then folks on the right hear about it and it getting publicized, and the kind of the whole polarization playing out, and your awareness of all that. And you also described, like, at that same gathering, talking later in the day with other Jews who were there who had the same kind of feeling as you, and really, didn't know, what exactly to do. And that you then heard of somebody who did speak up privately to the speaker and was not received well. And you talk very honestly about this and wanting those in the Palestine solidarity movement to really go beyond expressed commitments to fighting anti-Semitism, kind of more nominal commitments, to actually doing something when anti-Semitism shows up in criticism of Israel. And, I will say that definitely I've had experiences like that, and also have had, specifically Palestinians like really have my back in moments like that. And so that has taught me a lot, and has been one of the ways that I have been able to stay in the room. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, how you think these dynamics that I just kind of described, which have been going on for quite a while, how have they shifted since you wrote the book, which of course was written before October 7th, published, around October 7th, and came out
Mm.
just after, published just after. And really like thinking about the role that Jews, both within the Palestine solidarity movement and those Jews outside of it, have in fighting the ways that anti-Semitism is showing up in critique of Israel. And like, how can the solidarity strategy that you and Shane are putting forth really help us move the needle around this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, in some ways it's changed since October 7th. In some ways it's the same. I mean, I think I'll start, in something that, I'll start a bit in the past again. I mean, I think a lot, if you look at social movement history, and there's so many examples of, say, the women's movement. There's so many examples of, feminists, maybe in the early Black Power movement, who had to really work to get their male comrades, to take women's liberation, seriously. Or the gay rights movement had to really push back in its early years against so much entrenched, homophobia in progressive spaces, or even once there was some awareness of gay and lesbian liberation, trans folks had to speak up and say, "Hey, wait a minute, you are missing us."
Yep.
There's all these examples, unfortunately, of sometimes it does start, and members of an oppressed group who do have to do some work in progressive, spaces to make people aware that, hey, this is a gap, this is an issue, right? And if those folks had just, kind of walked away and given up, there would never have been that opportunity for transformation. And I think we are in a moment like that around anti-Semitism, where over the last decade or so, there's been a rise of progressive Jewish folks in social justice movements who have begun to say that, hey, we need to kind of have an awareness of this, have an analysis, not only like a surface level Here's what to say. Here's what not to say. Oh, don't put like an octopus on your flyer or whatever. But also like a deeper analysis of here's how anti-Semitism is, structurally works in the world. And we're still working on that. And I think it's made a lot more difficult, honestly. By the way, that the issue of anti-Semitism is so hyper polarized and politicized that I think a lot of leftists don't want to even think about it because they're so bruised and they're so frustrated from years of trying to just argue for basic Palestinian human rights and being called anti-Semites by people with a lot more power than them, by elected officials on both sides of the aisle, by university administrators, by unfortunately many Jewish community leaders. And so I think it's an uphill battle sometimes to get some progressives to want to take this seriously. And like you said, there are encouraging also signs of people who really are committed to it and who see that that anti-Semitism is rising uh, and who want to wrestle with the difficulty sometimes. It is possible. I think a lot of criticism of Israel is often mislabeled as anti-Semitism, but as you said, that doesn't mean that some criticism sometimes, is indeed anti-Semitic. I mean, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory of power, and when people, voice criticisms of Israel or Zionism or U.S. support for Israel, it's possible, and it does happen. And that conspiracy theories can sometimes be there they aren't aware of, especially in our social media age with all the rage post October 7th, seeing the horrific devastation of Gaza and Lebanon and now Iran that's ongoing. So this is something that we still have to work on, and I think the headlines and what's going on in the Middle East and in our own country is making it, frankly, a lot harder. And when someone like Trump arrests Mahmoud Khalil and says, and tweets, Shalom Mahmoud and says, we are doing this to keep Jews, safe. That unfortunately also plays a role in fomenting anti-Semitism. It makes people think that Jews are the power behind the scenes here. So I think we have a lot of work cut out for us, and there is unfortunately some anti-Semitism now that is in the world that can sometimes be on our social media feeds that we do have to raise awareness of. But as you said, I also have a lot of hope from having people at my back who see what's going on and who want to try to work through all of this together.
I Thanks, Ben. As you were talking, a question came through in the chat just asking, "Hey, Diana, can you talk about like how Palestinians have had your back?" And I think you just went into, many different stories that include Palestinians. And just to add to what you're saying, I think it's that piece where people have been like, I heard that, I saw that, like, I got you, and I'm going to go have a direct conversation with that person, a private one, or I'm going to challenge it publicly. And, I know you have, as have I, had the, really the honor, the privilege of being on panels with Palestinians where we're talking about anti-Semitism and we're talking about, what it actually means to have that structural understanding in which we are all connected and we can actually advocate for each other's well-being, each other's safety, each other's, experience of justice and peace and dignity. Um, Ben, there's a couple questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we have just a few more minutes. So I just want to turn to one, kind of asking you kind of to think broadly, because there's been so much going on in universities, and I know you're also connected with some of this as well. And you at one point were working in the university space, and really wondering if you have anything to comment to say about kind of the debate over what is or is not anti-Semitic. When, for example, like extreme critique of Zionism that can be, dehumanizing toward Zionism or people who carry Zionist beliefs. is that anti-Semitic or not? Considering the consequences, for example, which it can be, you lose your job, or you are like doxxed and smeared, and people are, coming to your home and attacking you that way. I'm just curious, what you have to say about how we kind of see that line, and then also what do we do when somebody says something that is like hurtful, right? Which may or may not be by definition anti-Jewish. It might be anti-Zionism, as in, that political ideology, or it might be anti the state of Israel. It might not be playing on anti-Semitic tropes necessarily. What do we do in
Yeah.
those moments? Because something needs to be done, right? Because there's a lot of polarization, a lot of loss that happens in those moments.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I think I think there's been such a push in recent years to find a one size fits all formula to figure out where is the line, between valid criticism of Israel, Zionism, and anti-Semitism, and people offer all these definitions, right? The IHRA definition is the most popular one that I would not advise anyone go near or adopt. There's unfortunately a very concerted campaign to get this definition enshrined into university policy, but often I think it's of limited value to kind of think that we can find a one size fits all, a single definition, a series of simple lines and criteria that that we could point to in every instance. Is this anti-Semitic or not? Let's go consult the definition. I think what so many experts tell us is that attention to context and to detail is so important. I mean, if someone scrawls, free Palestine on a with chalk on a street corner, a random street corner, that's not anti-Semitic. That's a statement of solidarity. If they scrawl it onto the corner of a Jewish senior citizens home, that is anti-Semitic. They are targeting a Jewish building and associating all Jews with Zionism, right? So that's a really kind of easy example of how context always matters. So it's important, I think, to look at context, to be able to separate discomfort from danger. I mean, like you said, I think universities, especially, are a place where we should feel challenged. We should encounter uncomfortable ideas. Our beliefs should be challenged. We should question our assumptions. And so, I think it can be easy to mistake that discomfort for danger. I just said that, I don't love definitions, but I do love this one line from the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism that is a definition that says, yeah, even strenuous criticism of Israel that might be unreasonable. I think it says, the difference between unreasonable speech and reasonable speech is one thing, but that's not the same as anti-Semitism. So we may think that, oh, this criticism of Israel or Zionism is very unreasonable. This person is very uninformed. It might not be anti-Semitism. So what do we do? I think, like I said earlier, I think relationships are very important. I think if it's your friend, if you have a relationship, if it's someone in your chemistry class, I mean, you have to work with every day. If you have that commonality, and you can build together, and what we say in activist world is as calling in and not calling out. I mean, not going to social media. Not, not, not calling your congressman and saying, hey, prosecute this person, but, trying to have a conversation from human to human, and trying to really listen to each other, to hear the emotions, to connect on a human level, to really be able to share maybe where you're coming from, and hear where they're coming from, and be open to the possibility of transformation, and keeping your heart open. And I think that that we will learn a lot, and maybe they will learn a lot too. I think it's very hard, but I do think I have heard of many cases of people who are Zionist and anti-Zionist being able to really hear each other, and maybe their opinions aren't going to change about this conflict halfway around the world, but they can be more open to where the other person is coming from. And I think that that is the first step, I think, towards transformation. Um,
Right, absolutely. Like building bridges, building sturdy bridges is not like you did it once, it happened, now it's done, we figured it out, we moved on. It's like you come back, you come back, you come back. That's what I'm hearing you say.
yeah.
And Ben, we now have several questions. They've come through, but I'm going to just stick with the two that we said we would respond to, unfortunately, because we are almost out of time. Just some quick responses to these because of time only. They're all juicy, as well as the third that we unfortunately won't get to. The first one is just, some thinking about this is from a person who's, saying they appreciate the message of solidarity, which they feel deeply as a trans woman, and how being in challenging spaces can be very generative and not something to shy away from. At the same time, not all spaces are useful to be in, and kind of wondering what framework you can give or, ideas for how to have boundaries around anti-Semitism and engagement or disengagement with spaces that are anti-Semitic. I'll just put that one out there. And then the last one for, again, a quick comment is thinking about, there's apparently, which I didn't even know, a workbook inspired by your book, and just wondering how that effort is going to actually, take action from this place of solidarity.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I really appreciate, you raising that. I think I'm not, I think we should try to build relationship, but if there's people in our movements who just really insist on telling you that the protocols of the elders of Zion are true, that's not someone you have to be like, oh, let me hold your hand and really hear where you're coming from. I think we also have to be able to really yeah, draw a firm line against really overt bigotry and again, there's no one size fits all answer, but I really do think that yeah, we have to also tolerate, not tolerate, bigotry in our movements, in our spaces, our relationships, and holding that is very real. And I appreciate. There is a workbook. I think it's called Bringing Safety Through Solidarity to Life. I would encourage people to go look it up, and it's a great toolkit and guide, I think, for especially working with synagogues and
Mm.
institutions and thinking, how can we examine our own practices, whether that's the way we approach, our security, the relationships we're building with our neighbors, the way that we approach conversations around Israel-Palestine, or abolition, or militarism. I think it's important to kind of have those conversations and start from somewhere, and start from where we are rooted. And so I think that's a great workbook, and there are others as well. And I encourage people to have those conversations. I think it's slow and steady, but I'm encouraged hearing my friends talk about that work they're doing in many different communities is really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. I love that the workbook is out there. I can't wait to check it out. And I just appreciate so deeply your commitment to staying in it and to being a model for others, and giving us different ways that we can stay in it. I'm going to invite Pamela to come back and join us to close out, and just quickly want to say thank you to you, Ben, for such a rich, really, really nuanced and complex conversation. I wish we could talk for hours more. I'm sure we will at another time. And thank you again to Pamela and the JCC for having me as part of this.
Well, thank you both so much. It's a challenging, difficult framework for a lot in our community to wrap our heads around. I really appreciate everyone who's attended and been part of this conversation. I want to thank Diana, want to thank Ben so much for the thought that they brought to this conversation. I did want to make a mention that there was one comment in the chat about maybe the word anti-Semitism overall is an overused word, and maybe there are other terms that are kind of coming to bear. So something for us all to think about. But I think that with the workbook, hopefully this book and that workbook, this has been hopefully a generative conversation for people. I heard a lot of words moving the needle. And other things, transformation, Ben, is a word that you use many times. So hopefully if we stay there and keep doing the work and conversation with each other, that's what will happen. So thank you all so much for attending and being part of this. As I mentioned, the book is still on sale through our JCC website. Thank you so much to our guests, and we really appreciate your joining us today. Thank you all.
Thanks so much for having me, and keep it up.
Thank you so much, Ben.